So this is something I see come up a lot, be it in person or online. There's always someone who seems to think that there's an age limit or that if you start late, there's no way you're ever gonna get good at something, be it a new art form like music, drawing, or even just a new trade. By late, I mean starting in your 20s all the way to your 70s. That's certainly quite a broad age range, but I think we can all agree that past your teenage years, that's when people kind of start to think, oh, maybe I'm getting a bit too old to learn something. So I think it's fair to say to consider that late. With that in mind, I fit into the category that I just described for starting late. I started music at 22 and being 25 now, sure that wasn't a long time ago, but 3 years of playing bass and electric guitar, I think I've already learned a few things and I can share some experiences and phases I've gone through during this learning process. And I'm sure there's people out there watching, maybe even watching this video right now, who are younger or older than me thinking, well, 22, that won't translate to my experience. And I completely understand that if you're, for example, 40, 50, 60, whatever age you might be. But I wouldn't say that's entirely age dependent because we're all individuals. Your learning experience won't be the same as mine and vice versa because we all have different capabilities, different capacities, and even different motivations. However, there's always certain aspects and parts of learning anything that can always be shared independent of however old you might be. One of the main concerns you might be having, or at least I can say for sure that I had 3 years ago, is that if you don't start young, you'll never be good or as good as you want to be. And that's simply not true because it all depends on how often you practice, how much you're motivated, and ultimately how much you enjoy what you're doing. However, I don't think you should be worried about how much you could have already progressed if you'd started earlier, because you never know. There's people who start young and they end up giving up on the instrument or just dropping it because they were forced on it at a young age, and then they just lose interest in music even if they had an inclination for it. I think if you're worried about being good or how good you could have been if you started earlier, although at first it may seem like a bad thing because, oh, well, I could have been this, I could have done that, it ultimately doesn't matter because maybe if you started earlier, you might have not even gotten to do any of it. So if you can convert that worrying energy into practice energy, into being motivated, into setting your own goals, I think you might be on a really good path to being a great musician, or you can just pick all of these messages up and translate them to any other area that you might want. There's also this idea that after a certain age, you just can't learn or you lose ability to learn. And that's true, but it's not as linear as many people make it out to be or believe it to be. The reality is that while you do lose some capacity, your brain can always learn. Maybe you learn a bit slower, but it's always ups and downs, always pros and cons, because let's say you're a young kid who's beginning to learn music. So sure, your brain might be at its prime for learning, but you might not have the capacity for responsibility, patience, or dedication that you might have once you're, say, 25, 35. So things kind of balance each other out. Starting young does not mean you'll be excellent at music or anything. I'm sure you've all heard stories, or at least one story, about a kid being pushed into learning music by his parents, and the kid never even had an inclination for it in the first place. The parents just wanted to get rid of him for a while, in worst case scenarios, or maybe even had the best interests in mind, but you can't just force learning music. I mean, you can to a degree, but you'll ultimately just be wasting time and money that could be spent elsewhere learning something that the kid might really benefit from. To a certain degree, I think that things in life happen when they're meant to happen. You can't rush some things, and music, in my opinion, definitely falls into that category. So if you're only now feeling that aspiration, that desire to learn music, to be a good musician, whatever you might want, I think now might be the right time. So worrying if, oh, I could have started earlier or anything like that, it's ultimately pointless, because if you've never felt that desire, then it would have just ended up in nothing. Being a late starter might be more common than you think. I wouldn't say it's exactly common because, well, at least in my experience, I still get a lot of shocked and surprised reactions whenever I tell people that, oh, I only started learning music at 22. On one hand, I understand, but at the same time, I think it just shows the whole point that I'm trying to make here. Most people just stop considering new things when they reach a certain age. To illustrate my point that starting late is perfectly fine and doesn't mean anything in the long run, I'm gonna give you a few examples of musicians who have started late as well. So an example of an early late starter, if you will, is Wes Montgomery. If you don't know who he is, I highly encourage you to check out his music. He's one of the greatest jazz guitarists of all time and universally known within that genre. He picked up guitar in his 20s, and while you might say that he was a musical genius, which I agree with, he wouldn't have even ever known that if he hadn't started music in the first place. And now an example of someone who truly started late in life, we have James Louis Carter Ford, who picked up the guitar at 58, that's quite impressive, and managed to have a successful career with it. He made some really old school style blues, he had his own playing technique much like Wes Montgomery did, and I think he's a great example of not only having started later in life, but also managed to making a career out of it, especially taking into account that he was illiterate and he worked many blue-collar jobs throughout his life, even having some serious run-ins with the law on more than one occasion. And for a final example, because I don't want to give you too many examples, there's many out there, I encourage you to go and search them up. We have another early late starter, if you will, which is Johnny Ramone. Johnny Ramone, while he also had some musical experience before seriously picking up the guitar, he only really started learning how to play it at 22. And while Johnny Ramone might not exactly be as proficient as, say, Guthrie Govan, that's not really the point of music. The point of music is to just play it however you want to play and play it however it makes you happy. You'll never know how good you are or can be until you try something. So just because you didn't start earlier doesn't mean you might not be a musical genius in the making. Something I'd consider particularly important if you're having concerns like this, or you're just curious, and I'd say it applies to all ages, but it's particularly important for people who might be having these concerns, is measuring your own expectations and setting your own goals appropriately. Because I think it's perfectly fine and it's really good to see people with very high goals and aspirations in life. However, you should think of it like stairs. You should think and take things one step at a time until you reach that goal, and be realistic. You're not going to become a great shredder in 2 months of starting guitar. Or maybe I'm just completely wrong. You might be a genius. I've had these concerns as well, and I still have them from time to time. However, seeing my own progress and reaching my goals has ultimately thrown them out the window and just completely nullified them. I hope this video helped you out, maybe in realizing that concerns you might be having or had, you're not alone in them. There's a lot of people who feel the same way for any area, not just music. So if you liked it, then just leave a like. If you'd like to share an experience or comment on anything I've said, then please leave a comment. I always read them all. And, well, if you'd like to see more videos like this, or just be interested in whatever I might be coming out with, then just subscribe.